Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now I thought it was time to go back a little and to revisit some of the basics, which I haven't really touched on in a while. Now dry brushing is one of those things where I think a lot of people turn their noses up at it. They think it's maybe I hear it often referred to as a basic technique when the truth is a little more complex than that. You can get some pretty good results using dry brushing, especially for the basis of how you're painting. And I want to sort of demonstrate that today. So I have already painted an order of our Martyred Lady Battle Sister, that's quite a mouthful, for the channel before. But because they have got these new miniatures, I thought it would be useful as well to tackle, the new plastics and show you how you can get a pretty cool result using that. Now this method does use a few more paints than usual, because I'm going to dip into a couple of shades extra than I normally would, but everything you see here is just dry brushing. So, if you want to follow along, the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. Now it's worth a really quick note on why I've got her standing here on this cork. Reason being, the new sisters have quite a lot of dynamism in their sort of poses and these cloaks, and it can be quite difficult to reach underneath, in order to paint those if you've got them standing on a standard base. So I've drilled a tiny little hole just in the bottom of her boot there, and used a bit of pin to stick her onto the cork. Now this is not strictly necessary. You can paint these miniatures attached to their bases as normal, just glued in place, but I tend to find it a little bit easier for some of what we're going to do to have access to the back of the cape in there. So that's why we've done that. Now when it comes to priming, I've used the Army Painter's matte black spray, but any black paint will do the job here. Rust-Oleum, Halford's Black, Chaos Black, any old black primer, and there she is. Now the reason why that black primer doesn't particularly matter is because she's not going to stay black for long. I've got here some Corvus Black, and this is really more of a dark grey. We're going to put this all over her armor, so I've added just a little bit of water to make sure that this flows properly, and her leg is probably a good place to start. Just a quick coat of this, and you don't need to be terribly careful with it. Reason being is if we have just flat black and then we shade that, it doesn't look particularly interesting. It's still just black all the way down. Whereas if instead we use a dark grey, we can highlight it and shade it. And to our eyes, it's still going to look black. So any sort of size brush that will do the job for this, just go around now. And one quick coat. You're not really looking to massively change the color of the miniature. Let's put on some Corvus Black. Now after a quick pass with the Corvus Black, we have this really dark grey sister. I've made sure to hit all of her armor with this stuff, and you'll see that it doesn't quite look black yet, but that's fine. We're working towards that. We're actually going to put her to the side for a second so that I can show you an extremely useful tool. That's right. Cardboard. Now this is any ordinary cardboard. I've taken it out back and I've primed it in black because we're going to get a very slight texture to this, which is super useful when we want to see what we're going to leave behind with a dry brush. So I've got one of my little makeup brushes here, and I've loaded this up with some Ethereum blue and then scrubbed most of it off, and you'll see I'm not leaving very much there at all, so I need to add more paint to my brush. So why would we bother with this at all? Well, short answer being, dry brushing is one of those arts where if you have too much paint on your brush to begin with, you are in for a bad time. Let's try that again. A little more paint on the brush. Okay, now on our cardboard, as I go over the same place repeatedly, you can see I'm starting to pick up that detail. Now this is useful because I can now take this brush and start applying it to my sister, knowing what I'm going to leave behind on flat areas too. So now I'm going to concentrate along edges of detail, so like the sides of her shoulder pad here, up along the top of her power pack, knee pads and such, because there are quite a few bits. That's a really nice edge there. There are quite a few bits on the sister which have, a really sharp edge to them. And with our brush prepared, we're pretty confident we're not going to leave too much of this paint behind. So what I'm going to do now is go around all of the armor. And I'm not too worried if I hit things like the bolt gun and similar, while I'm working here, because they are going to be painted later. For now, I just want a little bit of Ethereum blue to pick out the edges of the armor. Now, after about 3 minutes with my dry brush, I've got this. And you'll see there's actually some really neat modulation of color between higher areas and those smooth, flat panels. But in some places, it's gone a little more chalky than I might like. So what I've got, I have here my medium layer brush, and I'm going back to Corvus Black. Any areas where there's too much of this stuff, I thin down my Corvus Black a little more than usual, and let's tilt her this way. So we can see these little panels up by the side of her head here. I'm just going to fix up some of that with some Corvus Black so that it doesn't look quite so chalky in areas that I do want to be flat. And you'll find with this method, you'll be able to get sort of a fake edge highlight without having to spend a whole lot of time doing it. So these bobbles that have got a little more blue on them than I'd like, let's just flatten those out with a little of our base color. Now you don't want to cover over all of that dry brush, just areas where it's gone a little too chalky. On areas like her knee and the center of her shin here, when we shade this, that's actually going to come out really well. You do want to leave a little more of this than you might think. What we'll move on to now is her robes. We are going to shade that armor a little bit later, but we're going to shade a whole bunch of black stuff together. So we're going to concentrate at the moment on our base coats. So I have here Gal Vorbak. Gal Vorbak? Yeah, it is. Gal Vorbak Red. I think he's a word bearer's character. Don't ask me. I don't know them very well. But this is a lovely, deep, almost purple color. And we're going to use this for the inside of these sisters' robes. Don't worry too much if you get it on the outside. The only area that you really need to avoid at this stage is the armor that we've already painted. Now, when it comes to other colors you might use here, if you've got corn red and you prefer a darker, almost sort of burnt red finish, that would work quite well here. Someone will ask what it looks like. I don't know. It will look like a darker red. But for now, I'm going to go around the whole miniature. And with the sisters, this is always a bit of a trick. What part is actually the inside and the outside of their robes? So if you get lost, take a look at the box art. I'm going to apply 2 coats of this and see what we end up with. Now that did take just 2 coats, and I'm actually really pleased with that color. That's a really nice shade of sort of off burgundy. I really like that. Anyhow, we're now going to do the same thing with the other side of her robes, and I'm using Mephiston Red for this. I mean, you'll see already how just that little splash of color makes that not black armor look all the more black. So I'm quite looking forward to putting this on. So Mephiston Red, away we go. Just a little bit of water in your paint as usual. And when you come near any edges, just slow down, take your time. Remember, of course, you can tidy up if you make any mistakes. The one part that you really want to avoid, hitting with this red is the armor. Don't worry too much about the underside of the robes if you do get some of them. Now, 2 coats later, we've got a nice solid red, and I have gone back with some of the Gal Vorbak red just to tidy up around the bottom where I'd made 1 or 2 mistakes. The reason why I'm doing my tidy up for this now, rather than at the end where I normally would, is because we're going to dry brush the red, same as we did the armor. And for this, I'm going to use Kindle Flame. So let's pop our sister aside for a second. We'll grab our cardboard and some dry brush. Now you'll see straight away, I've got 1 big smudge there, and that's because I've got too much paint on my brush. Ordinarily, if you're having trouble with dry brushing, the simple answer is you've got too much paint on your brush, or you're pushing too hard. So that's not going to leave... Oh no, I'm building up some color there. That's probably going to be ideal. I want a lot of control with what I'm doing with this dry brush because I'm using it on mostly flat surfaces. And the same as if you're painting smaller details with a traditional brush, a smaller dry brush is going to be really helpful here. So I'm going to lightly flick. Ooh, it always makes me nervous. I've done this dozens, hundreds of times even, and it still makes me nervous. But a few passes, you'll see I'm catching that curve in the cloak there. And you can build up over time, same as we did on the black, that highlight. Now we're going to use, it's actually a little difficult to see with the light shining right there, but we're going to use the same color to dry brush the Galvorback red, which will look a little extreme, but this is why generally you want to do the bright red first, and as paint comes off your brush, you don't have very much left, you can do this in a slope much more easily. So I'm going to take my time now, and I am going to go around all of the red and dry brush it with a little bit of Kindle Flame. So now we've got a little bit of highlighting on the inside of her cloak in some of those areas we can see from the front, and when we spin her around, we've got that same on the back there. Now we're going to shade that, and we're going to use the same shade for both of those areas, because it's going to darken down the shaded areas of the red, the bright red, but it's also going to tie in the sort of fleshy color that we have there and make that a little bit more red on the inside of her cloak. So let's load up some Carroburg Crimson, and we're going to gently apply this over all of the red areas. You don't really want to overload this, so take your time, and if you think you're leaving too much in any recesses, just move it away while it's still wet. Same too on the bright red at the back. Just apply a coat, wait a couple of seconds to see how it settles, and then you can move it away from any areas where it's pooling too much. Now you'll see very quickly how that dulls down that orange effect on the inside of the cloak, and on the back we get a nice muted highlight. It looks a little more natural, like a gradient of color, that works quite well. What you can do, and I am going to do it later, is to add a little bit more Kindle Flame on the bright orange areas, because I want those to stand out just a bit more to the underside of the cloak than is right there. But for now, we're going to move on to a couple of more colors. So I've got here some Corax White. Now this stuff, you do want to add a little bit of medium to it and an agitator or two, like a couple of steel balls in the pot itself, because this will gum up really quickly, unfortunately. But if you take good care of it, it's a really good white base coat. So I'm going to add the white now. Now when I'm doing the face in particular, let's tip her back here. When I come to do the face, I'm going to paint in both her hair and the face in Corax White, because it's going to make it much easier to paint the skin than doing it over black. So let's paint in all of the white now. Now that will take 2 coats, and you're going to end up with a fairly pale sister, but not to worry. I've got here now Dryad Bark, and we're going to use this on all of the leather things that she's wearing. So these gloves, and you'll notice straight away we're doing this before we do any sort of metallic bits, because there are going to be a lot of like studs and zippers and buttons and stuff, which we might want to paint silver as our next step. Now the amount of gear she's carrying will of course dictate how long that step takes. I'm going to move on to Iron Hand Steel, and we'll paint in all of the silver details. Now, if you've got Lead Belcher, you can use that instead. The reason why I'm going for Iron Hand Steel here is that it's a little bit lighter as a primer, and you'll find as a result when we shade it, you won't need to highlight it if you don't want to, which is what we're trying to avoid here. Now once you've got down the large areas of the silver, you can switch on down to a smaller brush. I'm using here my small layer brush, and if you've got any, what do you call them, rivets or what have you that you want to touch up now, you can do that now. Any mistakes you make, you can go back to your base colors for this, which I might need to fix up on that glove, but we'll do that later. Now from here we're going to shade all of that detail. Now I'm going to use Nuln Oil and sort of a medium shade brush equivalent here. And we're going to apply this to the steel, the brown, the black armor. You don't want to go overboard with how much of you're applying, but when you come to these areas, just paint that on, let it pool, and as always, if you get big blotchy areas, you can move it away while it's still wet. Take your time when you come near any areas of red. You want to try and avoid getting any on there. If you do though, you can quickly rinse your brush off and normally wick that away while it's still wet. Now once that shade is dried, we've got a ton of depth in the weapon, The armor now finally looks properly black, but we have toned down all of that sort of blue tint to it. And yeah, I really like that. That's where it all starts coming together for me. Now what I've got is my teeny tiny little dry brush. I picked this one up from the stationery aisle of a supermarket. Look everywhere for tools. And we're going to dry brush Praxeti White very lightly along the hair. Ordinarily, if I'm painting towards the backpack, if I make a mistake, I'm going to hit the backpack. So instead, we'll start at the back and flick forward. And there we go. Highlight that nice and quick. If you're careful, you can also do the same on the shoulder pads. Better to do that once you've got a little bit more paint off your brush and onto the hair. Now once you've done that, grab yourself your small layer brush again, and I've got here Gilliman Flesh, which is one of the contrast line. I'm going to very carefully just paint this straight into her face. If I do hit the hair, well, at this stage I'm not too fussed. Just a quick coat of this. It's a little difficult to get the right angle to show you on the camera, but this will do the job. Now that's not quite dry, but I think you'll see how easy that is to do. I've been painting faces for 20 odd years, and that's the quickest way of doing it, I tell you. I've got now some Retributor armor, and there's just a handful of tiny gold details that we want to do now. So let's fill those in, just a quick coat of this. Now once that's dried, hell, you might have thought I was going to paint a miniature without Agrax Earthshade. The bolt casings on the Order of Our Martyred Lady now tend to have this really neat sort of darker, slightly rusty looking gunmetal on the bolter casing. So I'm going to use Agrax Earthshade over all of that and those gold details at the same time. Now this isn't going to give us a perfect sort of heavy metal team look, but it'll come up pretty close, and it is far easier than the way that they're doing it. Now while that dries, I'm going to tempt fate. I'm going to apply the decal to this sister. So now one thing I would recommend is when you're painting these guys, do spend the time to add the decals to them. It is a tiny wee thing, but it will add so much to the finished product. So what I'll do now is I'm going to go ahead and hit the back of the cloak with a little bit more of the Kindle Flame, like I said I would. I will let this decal dry properly. Then I'm going to hit her with a varnish and pop her on a base. Let's get a look at what this looks like when she's finished. Now there we have it. Our Sister of Battle is complete. Now the thing I really like about this particular technique is that it's not hard to improve upon it if you want to. So now that I've finished her, I could come back in a couple of days or a year's time, and I could highlight her armor again to make it a little sharper, or her robes, or do something with her face. It's really up to you if you want to take this further once you've got these foundations down. Now to my mind as well, it's also really useful for demonstrating that dry brushing is a skill just like any other. It's one which is, I think, a little easier to do than to edge highlight, but in order to get a smooth result, something similar to what we have here, you do need to take your time with it, so it isn't necessarily faster. So have a think about that when you want to approach how you're going to paint something for the first time. Now, as always, thank you very much to Exit23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who keep me ticking in paints and glue. And this time, I'm going to mess up the order and say it differently. So to Fred, Jimmy, Trainboy, Kyrie Crawford, and Alan Nuttall, thank you very much for your support. Everybody's contributions really makes a big difference. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.